Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here, and thank you to these panelists. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. This conversation is really going to set the stage for the rest of the day, and we're hoping it can be kind of a broad overview to the discussions we're going to be having. So I'm going to start with Nela and just go to her for what is the big picture you're seeing in the American housing market? What are the dynamics that we're now experiencing, and how are they changing?
This is a market like we've never seen before. I used to, 3 years ago, I would say things like the new normal and getting back to normal and what is normal. And then I was like, what is normal? This is not normal. And now I realize that we're in a different regime. And here's some things to keep in mind. First of all, the pressures that we're seeing in the for sale market are not isolated. They trickle down all the way through to affordable rental housing. So the pressure that we're seeing on the top of the funnel is really playing out in bigger ways in affordable housing, rental housing space. So that's important to keep in mind why I, as an economist, rattle off some statistics, right? So right now, when we look at home prices in the for sale market, prices are growing about 7% year over year in major metro areas. Now, what that means is that prices are still growing very strongly relative to historical averages. Usually, in the 50-year history before the financial crisis, prices grew about 1 or 2% above inflation. And then you ask, what is inflation? Yeah, that's another problem. But now it's growing at 7%, at least 5% above inflation. And there's no indication that that price growth is going to abate significantly anytime soon. And then we know that wages are not keeping up. So there's fewer and fewer people who are able to afford a home in major metro areas. Many of the middle class are being priced out.
Can you just elaborate on what's driving that 7% year over year rise?
It's lack of inventory.
Supply.
Lack of supply. The second thing to keep in mind is that this market is really fast. In 2016, it was the fastest market that we've ever seen, meaning the typical house basically flew off the shelves. As soon as it was listed, it was gone. That's how tight the inventory is. Fastest market we've ever seen. This year, 2017, is 5 days faster in terms of the typical home going off the market than it was last year. So the market even sped up 5 days. And that's significant. If you have a 30-year mortgage, and a home is selling in a week or two, you can't compete with an all-cash buyer. Mm-hmm. So again, that timing factor is even affecting people who have mortgages, who can't afford a home. They're still at a disadvantage in this market where cash is king. So the upshot of all of this is those house pressures mean that fewer people can be homeowners, and they're in the rental market, which increases rents. And it all goes back to supply. And I think that would be a great segue for the person who represents the source of that supply.
Let's hear from Rob.
Again, building on what she said in terms of what's the new normal is not a lot of home construction on the single family side. So we've got 3 different building markets, residential construction spaces. Remodeling is doing really well. In fact, remodeling is very hot. And the reason why is that those home price gains that have been generated by the lack of inventory have made homeowners wealthier. So there's kind of a generational wealth effect there. Mm-hmm. Homeowners are wealthier and they're staying in their homes longer because there's no inventory to go by, means they're remodeling their homes, aging in place remodeling, energy efficiency remodeling, the structural changes when there are demographic changes, becoming empty nesters. So that's helped the remodeling market. The multifamily market's in a different place. Multifamily has peaked. 2015 was the peak year of production. It's now declining. That represents a bit of a policy challenge because, as you said, you got fewer people who can afford to buy a new home, so rents are staying high, but we're not building as many apartments as we did 2 years ago. So that puts importance on programs like the low-income housing tax credit, which has a tax reform implication.
And can you say more about what's holding back inventory there if there is all this demand?
Well, on the single family side, we don't have a lot of construction. It's about 65% of normal. So the question is, what's going on? Demand is positive. Demographic forces are pushing demand. It's supply side constraints. And the big impacts for single family home builders are regulatory costs associated with building are higher. We have a persistent, and it's not going away, labor shortage. There are not enough lots to build on, which is a discussion about land use policy. And lending to builders. Typically when we think about lending and housing, we're talking about mortgages access. It's lending to builders from banks to build and buy and contract with labor. That's tight as well. And then building material prices. They're up 25%, for example, on softwood lumber this year. That's in part due to tariffs that we've imposed on Canadian softwood lumber. A third of the lumber used to build houses in the United States comes from Canada. And we made it 8% higher this year with tariffs. So 25% through the expansion of the market and those tariffs means it's harder to build those homes. And so the result then is feeding into what she said. We don't have a lot of inventory, and building's not going to help a whole lot. So we got to find new ways to provide that inventory going forward.
And you were going to say a third area for the market. Single family,
multifamily, and remodeling.
Oh, okay.
Those are the key. So remodeling good, multifamily is peaked over. It's single family where we need help. And you know, the industry itself has got to change. If the labor shortage is going to persist, we've got to find new ways of building homes, ways to do it cheaper. Policy can help, but maybe there's some technology issues as well that could help out in that context.
Well, I think you set up Andrea perfectly.
Thanks.
Andrea, tell us about your work at MIT.
Yeah, so at the Real Estate Innovation Lab, what we try to do is uncover the technological solutions that are aiming to disrupt or make more efficient certain elements of the housing sector or the commercial real estate sector with respect to multifamily. And what we're seeing is this uptick in startups that are really trying to tackle these problems on the supply side. So there has been a call to arms. This is not normal. And because this is not normal, technological solutions are being called into play. So on the one hand, there's lots of data that's being unearthed to try to understand where are the opportunities to free the land. So how do we free the land? How do we understand why the land is trapped and create systemic solutions for unlocking that land? Not saying that this is going to happen overnight, but there is a hacking going on with numerous startups in the Boston, in the New York, in the Washington, D.C. areas. That's one area. A second area is construction tech. Yes, construction is lagging behind in the technology sector. It's one of the places that loves to be analog instead of digital because of the nature of the workforce. However, that is increasingly changing. So what we're seeing is an uptick of R&D and emerging companies in robotics and artificial intelligence that can start to do the work in the construction sector. Another area that's very interesting when it comes back to this, how do we struggle with this supply problem beyond the land solution, but putting the buildings in place. Modular has really not moved in over 100 years in terms of its innovation capacity, and that's problematic. But we have a new approach. Technology and startups are saying, wait a second, we can do this better. So there's an uptick in startups that are actually saying, we're going to hit at this again. And that is something about technology. Companies might die, but technologies rarely do. So modular has never died. It's coming back again. You know, when it comes to understanding data and applying it to the construction sector or to the affordable housing sector, that's also starting to really take place and take form. You have to understand, big data is, what, 7 years old? This is a fairly new area. So to disrupt our very analog world and turn it digital is really starting to happen. So overall, what we're seeing is, from counts that I did this morning, there's at least 50 startups in the capital A affordable housing space. But when it comes to housing overall, when we're talking about something like Redfin, there's at least 400 or more companies that are really trying to hit at this space, particularly when it comes to housing and trying to hack at this affordable housing, lower A affordable housing crisis.
I feel like we've gotten this big picture now, but there's a lot of regional difference too in these markets. Can you guys jump in on what are you seeing at the more kind of city, state, coastal versus central? Like what are the big regional dynamics that are shaping this market?
You know, the one thing that surprises me about the current market is just how broad-based the inventory shortage and the affordability crisis is. We hear about it in Omaha, in Salt Lake City, just like we hear about it in San Jose. And the dynamics may be different in Cleveland, but there's still a problem there in terms of not having enough affordable places to stay.
Is that partly because of the way wages also are?
Exactly.
Right.
And that leads to the second point I'd like to make. It's not just about where you live, it's about where you live determining your opportunities for everything else in your life. Your access to high quality schools, your job opportunities, your access to health care, your ability to be a fully functioning economic member of society. And that's why that's such a challenge. It's not just about building homes in a desert with modular. It's about, building homes near public transit so that I can get to work and get to the babysitter by 6, which is material for most people.
But you would think it would also be an incentive to companies to locate in places where the cost of living are cheaper, but that we seem to be seeing instead of concentration in certain cities. I don't know, Rob, you probably.
Well, yeah, it's also where builders can build inventory. I mean, the real need right now, like on the single family side, is that entry level. The millennials are going to move from rentership to home ownership increasingly over the next 3 to 4 years, but that's going to occur in an environment in which home prices are going up because of the lack of inventory, rates are going up, so affordability is going to be challenged. So can builders add that entry-level product, which is tough to do when regulatory costs are high, and it's harder to do in coastal markets and other high-cost markets. And again, we'll mention another possible tax reform element. If the state and local property tax deduction, the income tax deduction make it more expensive to live in those high-cost areas, we could see a little uptick in some population mobility where people move increasingly to markets like Utah, Texas, the Carolinas, where it's easy to build, a little more affordable, and then that can have impacts, as you mentioned, in terms of being a member of the economic society, where the jobs are, where employers are going to go, because those workers can live more cheaply. And
just to piggyback quickly off of that, because that's basically Redfin's business. We pick up people on the West Coast and we move them to Nashville, where they buy in cash. And that puts another pressure because they can take those West Coast salaries and buy cheaper housing in the middle of the country. So those pressures also migrate as people try to find affordable places to live.
And it's not all gloom and doom in high-cost, large metro areas. I think there are solutions there. For example, builders in high-density, high-population environments, the townhouse market is doing really well. Typical townhouse is a little less than 2,000 square feet. You can build it on a smaller footprint, so when you're facing land and lot shortages, that's a solution. I think townhouses are a nice bridge between rentership to homeownership. The question is, can you build them at the right price? Can that technology be there?
And to make that sort of happen, there are a lot of companies that are saying, well, I'll take some of this capital that I'm acquiring in these major markets like New York City, like Boston, like Washington, D.C., like San Francisco, and then I'll prototype nice housing solutions, my modular solutions in dense areas like Nashville, like Pittsburgh, where it's a little bit more affordable to prototype, to get these technological solutions going, and then bring them back to these denser markets and say, hey, there's a proof of concept out there. We can move forward with these solutions. Can policy handle it? Can the labor market around construction, can you innovate? Can you pivot? Can you change? And then can also the data sort of handle the traction around that change to say we're going to measure innovation a little bit differently.
Andrea, I've seen some of the prototypes of those the new modular homes, and they're not what people think of when they think of modular homes. Can you talk a little bit more about what kind of the innovation is there, what they're trying to do, and what they look like at an aesthetic level?
So that's a really good question. I think that there's a very broad revisit to what's happening when it comes to modular overall. So construction is being done in warehouses. It's being done on site. It's being done. It's being done on a computer. So their feasibility around what is a structure that can go through entitlements and permits is being explored through computational architects. So there's a broad approach around how that product is going to go to the table, and that's different than it's ever been in the past 3 to 5 years. And another part of that is really that the materiality has changed. So on the one hand, yes, we've seen this increase in the cost of raw materials, and that is certainly very, very problematic. But efficiency in usage in these modular spaces is really making that a feasible construction type. So there's these trade-offs that are happening by using technology, digital tools, computational architecture, computational urban design, paired with modular construction that will enable these types of solutions to get off the ground. Now, will it enable it in very high dense markets? I don't know if that's really feasible at this stage of the game because of a lack of financial innovation and perhaps complications in policy support there. But maybe you can speak more to that.
And it's still a small part of the market.
Yeah.
97% of single-family homes are site-built, sticks and bricks, as they say. So I think that's going to change. I think it's going to grow. I think you'll see more components of homes being built in factories to collect economies of scale and deal with the labor shortage. So if you think about the underlying economics, demand is improving, the costs are going up, we don't have enough workers. They're all pointing to building homes a little more efficiently, but still, you know, the typical preferences on housing are not really changing. People still want single family, they still want home ownership, they want a suburban feel, maybe a little more walkable. That's why I think urban villages and townhouses are the way to go. But we've got to innovate and change how we build homes and then get some help on the policy side. Make land easier to develop in order to build apartments and single family homes, because we're simply not building enough right now, and that shows up in the rents and home price data.
But that doesn't mean, just to piggyback on that, I think that doesn't mean that there's a sacrifice to the amenities that we like to experience. So design does still come into play. So what you're talking about is an amenity bundle that the millennial likes to sort of experience and see when they're living and working and playing in the city. And so that amenity bundle doesn't necessarily have to go away because we've put this word modular in front of it. And in some ways, with the aid of computational architecture or computational design, we're sort of seeing an ability to play a little bit more in this space than we ever have before. So I think we should play harder, maybe a little faster in that, but agreed.
Were you going to jump in there?
Millennials like density. I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
I was like the walkable urban, the urban suburbs, because they do. It's so funny because the question I used to get asked is, do millennials still want to buy homes?
Right.
Like they have a choice. I mean, you try to find a $500,000 house in Silicon Valley that a typical millennial might be able to afford. I mean, I think they're being very rational given the economic realities of the market. But one thing that has changed is they don't seem to want as much the McMansion suburbs of the boomers.
Right.
They tend to want to keep their families in these urban, maybe not the city anymore, but still some kind of city-like amenities that they pull into a suburban environment. And that's where, you know, pairing these building solutions with great transit makes so much sense, because then you can build affordable units close to transit and have some kind of balance, which we don't have in most cities right now.
And so if you think about the two kinds of development that are going to be in vogue over the next decade, take a failing shopping mall, knock it down and put up an urban village that is townhouses and low-rise apartments. And then the other thing, sort of that inner suburb that's close to transit, a little more dense, tear down construction. You've got a lot of older housing stock that's close to central cities, and currently 10% of single family starts are tear downs. So taking a 1950s style house, knocking it down and putting up something that's high 2,000, 3,000 square feet that can have 2 or 3 kids. We see growth in both of those sectors as ways to help the supply challenge. Problem is neither one of those is necessarily going to solve the affordability challenge. And that's a local policy decision that really has a lot to do with land costs, development costs, and the regulatory costs associated with construction.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to hear a little bit more about, is the effect that these millennial preferences will have on affordability, both within the cities and in their inner ring suburbs. And I guess, following up on what you were just saying, what are the kind of local policy questions that we're going to have to grapple with as we see those changes kind of get, I mean, they're already underway. So.
Well, how do we tax and finance infrastructure improvements? You know, the options are an impact fee, which is literally a fee you pay when you build a home. which is taxing up front, or do you tax property taxes, basically after the home's built and you tax over the long run? I would prefer the second, and the reason why is because then you get the housing stock in place and then you collect the benefits. Unfortunately, a lot of localities view the impact fee as a piggy bank to raid from, and that reduces the amount of supply. The other challenges are, frankly, more political. It's green space, NIMBYism. You know, I don't want to live next to that apartment building, or I don't want that that farm that's next to me be turned into single-family homes. I represent the home builders, so no surprise where I fall on that. I think we need development. I think if you're going to grow a population and grow the job base, you got to build housing, and you got to build a variety of housing. The markets that are able to build that kind of housing and do so in cooperation with their local policymakers, they're going to grow. The markets that don't are either going to wither on the vine, or they're like Silicon Valley, they're going to outprice basically the workforce, and you're going to have a lot of people move to other communities, take advantage of opportunities.
Are there any shining examples of places that you feel like have done well on dealing with those in a thoughtful and forward-thinking way?
I've used it a lot. Greenville, South Carolina is a nice example of where, if you've ever visited, their downtown's been renovated. They've got a lot of employers because it's a business-friendly environment, but they've got townhouses, they've got apartments, they've got single-family homes on small footprints and smaller lots, decent transit. It's growing. The other markets that are really hot in terms of building right now are places like Utah. It's not as expensive to develop as it is in California and Oregon. So those are the communities that are going to grow. That's not to say that California markets or the coastal markets in the East Coast are going to wither or anything like that, but they're going to present challenges for their teachers and their firefighters and cops. Where are they going to live as those housing markets continue to be more expensive?
And it always goes back to the amenities that are provided by the locale, and namely schools.
Yeah.
So transit, schools, jobs, and housing are all connected, right? And that's the thing that's really hard to solve, is that you have to solve for each of these issues in terms of where you place it. Seattle, for example, 2/3 of the land in Seattle is zoned single family.
Right.
So it doesn't give a lot of wiggle room for new construction.
That's right.
And so all of these policies are local, and yet the problem has this national effect. So how do you get local municipalities to, think about the broader country and the broader macro environment? Well, it's very hard to do that, right?
I think
before you jump in 1 second, I'm just going to say we're going to go to question and answer pretty soon, so start thinking of what you want to ask. Andrea.
So coming to these solutions, a lot what's moving is also civic tech. So really trying to actually address this problem of saying, I know that as a planning community, I need to create a bundle of amenities that takes into account jobs, anchor institutions, places where people live, work, and play, house that they can actually afford, a transit option that they can actually afford. I don't own a car. I haven't owned a car in a decade. But I think the interesting thing is understanding how those technological solutions can really make change. And so the more prototyping that happens with governments that says, hey, let's look at where our pockets of feasibility and engineer and wiggle and push up against that, I think we'll start to make progress. It takes time, but I'm going to keep pushing that, saying that there's a lot of tech coming down the play that really wants to solve some of these problems, and I think that we should pay attention to what they're trying to do, and instead of saying, oh, it's a fad, say, well, what you got?
And tech has already revolutionized the home purchase decision. It has the capacity to go further and solve its own problem, right? Solve the supply problem. So I think that alignment makes a lot of sense. Tech is already involved in the financing of homes. So it's this next step that's so important on the commercial side. The residential side has been the low-hanging fruit of tech. It's now necessary to take those advances and apply it to the commercial and to multifamily construction as well.
All right, I'm opening it up to the audience. So someone will be coming around with a mic. Oh, we got one back there.
Oh. Hi, my name is George, and my question is actually for Robert. In terms of possibly shifting the power dynamics, like for your organization, it's a very powerful organization. In terms of housing, when builders come in, they're very powerful just based on the economics of being a builder. So when you gave the anecdote within my community, I live next to a park that is about to be torn out. It's about to be put up a 9-story building. The park was once a school. They tore out the school to put in the park. Now that's being torn out to be a 9-story building. Sitting on that park is also a co-op, where there are growers, and that can grow enough food for the community. So in terms of the shifting power dynamic, I happen to look at the sign to say, oh, they're having meetings about putting in a 9-story building. Most people aren't gonna see that little sign or look at it. So they're not gonna be there to have the dialogue. So when you're looking at building and talking about going up, why isn't it more of a cross conversation to say, well, why can't the garden move to the top of this building where it can still function and grow for the community? Like, how do we shift those power dynamics?
Yeah, NIMBYism is real. It does have impacts on the people that don't live next to the park currently and are looking for a place to live. I think maybe there's a potential to replace that with YIMBYism, or saying yes in your backyard and finding collaborative solutions. The thing that we hit from the economics is, if you want to provide the tax base to provide the park and the school and the communal growing area, you got to have the residents there in the first place. And if you don't build those homes, you're going to have higher rents and higher prices. Again, though, it's the markets that are going to grow, or the ones that enable construction to take place.
And I think that's part of the problem, is that these communities are trying to solve these issues and make these decisions on a block-by-block basis. Your community is trying to solve the housing for your community, but you don't see a lot of regional partnerships between communities and to solve this collectively. And that would help preserve a school and a park and a 9-story building if communities work together. There's less of that than I'd like to see.
But also, why does it have to be either or? I like your point of saying, why can't we have many of design precedents that would say, put the park on the bottom ground and build above, or put the park on the roof and create an access way. I know that is not precedent always, but there are precedents to say mixed use works between public space and housing.
Absolutely.
I think it would actually go back to this, I have this bundle of amenities that I really want in the city that's walkable, livable, playable. That makes a building playful.
Great, thank you. More audience questions?
Hi, I'm Marco Miguel from the Federal Reserve. Can the solution be more involvement of state governments on the regulatory policies that, because of NIMBYism concerns, are difficult to handle at the local level?
It may sound controversial, but that's actually a solution I've recommended, that state governments exercise some kind of constitutional oversight over local growth controls, do economic analysis, do cost-benefit analysis, provide those kind of regional patterns. Unfortunately, when decisions are made hyper-locally, the incumbents, the people who are already living there, do make it difficult to develop and make it more expensive.
Hi, I'm Jasmine Gibson from Kaboom. Andrea, I heard you say playful. Kaboom, we're the play people. And I was curious about the conversation between people who are dealing with housing and those who are doing planning and zoning and parks and rec more locally, about like being able to avoid displacing places where people play in order to like actually build together to make sure that when we are building these new housing, that also how people are going to play, how people are going to go to school is also considered.
You know, a lot of the building that we've seen in cities has been towards the high end. Understandably, builders were scorned a bit by the financial crisis, and margins are real and land costs are real. I think there is a need for a reimagining of how to build affordably, but that takes these kind of land zoning solutions that are not there yet. I would like to be playful, but I think there's some serious work that needs to be done before we can play. And that's really, how do you get localities to change their zoning practices to allow for the mixed use housing? That seems to be in demand by people of all kinds of demographics.
Andrea, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, it's definitely there. So neighborhood change is a very real stakeholder in this. I would say I would give it its own space in this. And on the one hand, creating neighborhoods that are designed and thoughtful from a regional and a local perspective takes a lot of thought and thinking and mindfulness. Now, on the other hand, does it mean that we can't sort of try and then also take into account local neighborhood stakeholders that say, hey, wait a second, you're displacing me, or there's a problem here, and how do I sort of gain in this solution? I think with technology that is happening, and I think with civic tech, a lot of people that I've spoken to at, for example, in Boston, at the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, there's no one in that office that's saying, we want displacement. No one is wanting that, but they are trying to figure out what is a way that we can actually get the information to the community so that they understand the changes that are coming down the pipeline. Literally, what are the planning changes, and also what is the developments that are coming, and how will it impact you, and showing you those solutions. So I think, for example, the Housing Innovation Lab there, they're really trying to prototype and show you what that will look like. And you have to say, okay, I want to see more of what that's going to look like. So as an academic, as a financial economist, I want to say, show me what the performance outcomes of that look like, for sure. But I think at the same time, it doesn't mean we can't have moving towards a more win-win situation.
And we've got to wrap up, but Nela wants to jump in with one quick thing.
And just to point back to Robert a little bit. And let's not forget, as much as we focus on state and local, there are federal solutions that are available. There is a federal toolkit that can expand the supply of housing that is currently being considered in tax reform. There are real solutions there. Robert's organization has been behind a lot of them, and that's part of the solution too. Let's not forget the federal government.
Low-income housing tax credit, private activity bonds.
We'll be talking about them a lot today. So
Good.
Thank you all so much. This was a great start to our afternoon. Thank you all for the questions.